Greetings. Welcome to another Scripture Discovery class. And Happy New Year. We are in the middle of a series on the topic of prayer. Now, this might be a little confusing for you if you're listening in or attending the services we have at Sawyer Highlands Church. If you recall, Scripture Discovery is taking the passages that are going to be preached on for the upcoming Sunday service. For example, last week we looked at Psalm 63, and Sunday, that's what I preached on at Converge. However, Pastor Rob was at our other site at Sawyer Highlands preaching on prayer, but using a different passage. And that's the passage that we're going to look at today. It's Matthew 26, verses 36 through 46. And so Pastor Rob is going to be preaching that this coming Sunday at Converge. So basically we're following the schedule of the Converge site. Okay, before we read the passage, let me give you a little bit of context to what's taking place because we're jumping right in the middle of a narrative. Matthew is the author, and this is during the Passover. If you remember, Jesus is with his disciples in this upper room celebrating the Passover. This is where he establishes the Lord's Supper. He gives some teaching. And if you look at the events that Matthew records, one of the things that I found interesting is the interactions that Jesus has with both Judas and Peter. So it's really important going through narrative to make a list of the characters that are involved. The characters of a story is very important to think about and who they are and why they are mentioned, what they say, what they do. Now, when it comes to the events that take place before these verses we're going to look at, if you recall, Judas actually goes out after he was exhorted by Jesus. He goes out and he finds the chief priests and strikes up a deal with them to deliver Jesus over. So that's where Judas betrays Jesus. And then we have the upper room scene where Jesus establishes again the Lord's Supper. But then he says that there's someone that's going to betray him, and woe to them, whoever that is. And remember, Peter speaks up, and that's where Jesus says to Peter, before the rooster crows, you, Peter, are going to deny me 3 times. So take note of these 3 main characters, Judas, Peter, and Jesus, and see how they come back into this narrative, specifically in these verses, 36 through 46. All right. Make sure that you have the passage printed out. Have a pencil or pen and highlighter ready, and let's jump into this passage. Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 through 46. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And taking with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, so why could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, for the 2nd time, he went away and prayed, my Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the 3rd time, saying the same words again. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. All right. Remember that this is taking place right after the Passover dinner. Judas is gone, and now Jesus is taking his disciples out. And we read in verse 36, then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. I'm just going to mark the first word, then, showing that this is one whole narrative, and we have to go back to the previous context to get the whole picture. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. Who are them? Well, we'll see here. And he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. So he's with the disciples, except for Judas, of course. And the command is, sit here while I go over there and pray. So I'm going to highlight I go and pray. So he's going to pray, but he's telling his disciples to sit here, and Jesus is going over there. Now, I'm really circling and highlighting these details because it helps me pause and imagine the scene. I can almost, in my mind's eye, see Jesus kind of pointing down to the ground. Sit here. This is the place you're to be. And I'm going to go over there, and he maybe points over to another area of this garden. Now, to me, just thinking of the scenario, it's a little odd that he would just have his disciples sit in this one spot, and then he's the one that's going to go and pray. And, we can ask that question, why? Why doesn't he instruct them to pray also? He doesn't, right? It's just sit here. He's going to be the one praying. We can ask those questions, but let's be careful how much we speculate and be careful about how much time you spend trying to figure out what's really going on. Because here's the thing about narrative. The author is including the information that he sees important. We should understand that Matthew isn't writing an exhaustive, deeply detailed account of these events. There's probably other things that are said, other details that Matthew is leaving out, because it may not be essential to the main point. And so maybe that's the bigger question to ask instead of these little detailed questions. And that's, why does Matthew include this event in his gospel? What is it that he really focuses on when he's explaining this event? So that's something to consider and think about as we study narratives. Now, verse 37, and taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee. So that would be James and John. Now remember, this isn't the first time that Jesus separates these three from the other disciples. He does the same thing at the Transfiguration. He has the disciples wait at the bottom of the mountain, and he takes Peter, James, and John with him. And that's in Matthew chapter 17. Again in verse 17, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. I'm going to mark that phrase to be. And the question I have is, how? Matthew has some inside knowledge. Matthew's not there. So how does he know that Jesus began to be sorrowful and troubled? And there's two options. First, that Jesus talked about this event after his resurrection. He shared these moments with his disciples and maybe opened up a little bit about what was going on emotionally with him. And again, that's after Jesus rose from the grave and appeared to the disciples. The other option is Peter or James or John or all three observed Jesus being sorrowful and troubled. Maybe just by looking at his face and looking at his actions and his motions, he was in some way visibly sorrowful and troubled. And Peter, James, and John picked up on it. So what would that look like? That's kind of my question. And let's underline the word sorrowful and troubled. Now look at verse 38. Then, and we'll just mark that, you see a chronology taking place, right? In verse 36, then Jesus went here and said this and went off a little bit farther with Peter and James and John, and then he said to them. So Matthew is walking through this event step by step. Jesus said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful." We'll mark that word very and underline that word sorrowful again and point it back to the previous verse, back to sorrowful and to troubled. I think that's what is being expressed. And this perhaps verifies for Peter, James, and John, who might have seen signs of sorrow and trouble on Jesus' face and actions. So Jesus expresses this. My soul is very sorrowful. I'm also going to circle my soul. I think I'm doing that mostly out of habit because if you recall back to our previous episode, Psalm 63, I think that's how we structured that whole entire psalm, is kind of following that phrase, my soul. But here, Jesus is speaking about his soul, it being sorrowful, even to death. That seems to be an extreme way to describe how sorrowful you are. I am so troubled that I feel like I'm going to die. That's what it seems like Jesus is expressing in verse 38. And then he says to the three, remain here and watch with me. So I'm going to highlight that phrase. Now notice what I've been highlighting in orange. Verse 36, sit here while I go over there. And again in verse 38, remain here. So he's speaking specifically to the three disciples. And I think we're going to kind of see that kind of language as we continue on. Also notice, and I'm kind of making some assumptions here. Remember back in verse 36, he tells the disciples to sit at the specific location while he goes and prays. But now in verse 38, when it comes to the three, Peter, James, and John, they are to watch with Jesus. And so what does that mean to watch with me in verse 38? Well, I'm thinking it has something to do with prayer. So I'm going to point it back to prayer. Now, I'm not saying that that phrase, watch with me, is the same as praying, but there's some connection there. And me making that line and pointing it back to prayer is going to help me think about it a little bit more as I look over the text throughout this week. Okay, down to verse 39. And going a little farther, so I'm going to highlight that phrase, a little farther. He fell on his face and prayed. So I'm highlighting the phrase, he fell on his face and prayed. And I mean, that's why he's falling on his face, right? It is to pray. It's the posture of prayer. And I'm going to point that back to verse 38 and that phrase, watch with me. And also notice what I'm highlighting in orange. It seems like Jesus is distancing himself. And now we see what he prays. My Father, if it be possible, if, this is a condition, right? If it be possible, I think that's a word we really need to circle, the word possible. If there is any possibility at all, what's the ask? Let this cup pass from me. So I'm going to underline that phrase. Nevertheless, so we'll mark that word. Basically, he's saying, hey, if it's at all possible, I prefer for this cup to pass from me. However, on the other hand, and what does he say? Not as I will, but as you will. And we definitely have to highlight that phrase. And I think this is a perfect example of how Jesus has taken a position of a servant. He's serving his people, and he's also being subordinate to the Father. He's willing to submit to the Father. This is a role that Jesus takes on, and we see this role portrayed in other places in the New Testament. I think in the Gospel of John, there's multiple times when Jesus says that all the things he does, all these miracles and healings, is by the authority of the Father. So it's the Father who's giving Jesus the authority to do these things, which portrays, again, Jesus taking on this subordinate role. But this is something that we could spend hours talking about and researching. Also, we can spend a lot of time thinking about that statement, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Is there any possibility for Jesus to avoid the cross? Or maybe another question to ask, which is similar, is, are there other ways that God can save his people from his wrath? Are there other options out there? And I believe we would have to come to the conclusion, no, because in the end, Jesus does go to the cross. This is the only possible pathway to salvation. And we don't have time to really unpack that, but I think there's a very compelling argument from Scripture itself for the reason why Jesus had to go to the cross in order to save souls. Anyways, before I dig myself into a deeper hole, let's continue on. Verse 40, and he came to the disciples. We'll mark that again. He came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, and I think he's this color, so could you not watch with me for 1 hour? I think when I read this verse out loud to you, I probably said that phrase with a bit of irritation in my voice, right? I'm imagining Jesus being a bit irritated here. I don't know if he really was. But again, we see that phrase, watch with me, and I am going to point that back to prayer, and I'm also going to mark that phrase 1 hour. Now that orange box, usually I try to be consistent and mark everything I kind of have a question about with an orange box. So the question is, man, did Jesus really pray for an hour? I mean, there's a lot that we're missing if that's the case. I mean, we only have one phrase in verse 39 of what he prayed. So what else was said? Or what were the other ways that Jesus engaged with his Father? And we don't really know. And of course, the disciples at some point can't tell us. Peter, James, and John can't tell us these things because they fell asleep. They don't know what all was said between Jesus and the Father. Oh, and by the way, we do have to ask this question again in verse 39. How does Matthew know what was prayed specifically? Again, did Jesus open up a little bit more after the resurrection and shared with his disciples what was going on that night? Or was Peter, James, and John close enough to listen in to Jesus and him praying? Anyways, back to verse 40. The question is, was this really 1 hour of watching and praying? And here again in verse 41, Jesus giving a command, watch and pray. Aha. This is where we see watching and praying come together. And I think this is really important. Watch and pray that. Here's the whole reason why Jesus is doing this and asking his disciples at least to watch, and now in verse 41 to also pray. Sorry, not necessarily all of his disciples, but at least the three, Peter, James, and John. So he says, watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. Now we're going to highlight that phrase and we're going to make it that, teal blue, because it's referring back to the disciples, or at least 3 of them. So watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. And Jesus continues on, the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Now I'm going to also highlight that phrase, but I'm highlighting it purple. And I'm wondering if this phrase in verse 41 has any relationship with the phrase in verse 39, not as I will, but as you will. So I'm going to make an arrow to verse 39, but think of it as a reluctant arrow. I'm not sure if it really connects. It's a question, but something that I want to think about. Because look, the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Jesus is inferring some type of battle going on. And I think in verse 39, you kind of see that as Jesus prays, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. So here's the battle. He wants to follow God's will, but he also is troubled and very disturbed by what's about to take place. Makes me want to ask this question, and I'm putting this question right over that phrase, you may not enter into temptation. So the question is this why Jesus is praying? Is there temptation that Jesus is dealing with? And we won't take any time really diving into that question, but I do think it's interesting to think about. Let's keep plugging away. Verse 42, again, and this is for the second time, he went away and prayed. So I'm highlighting that phrase again. He went away and prayed. And of course, I'm going to point that back to verse 41. Watch and pray. And again, we get to read what Jesus prayed. This time, it's, my Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. Again, there's a condition. If this cannot pass, and remember we circled the word possible in verse 39 when he prayed something similar, and that's why I'm circling that word cannot. Basically the same thing. If this cannot pass unless I drink it. And the reason why I am marking these with those orange squares is just thinking through this metaphor that Jesus is using with a cup and drinking. So if you remember back to verse 39, the phrase, let this cup pass from me. Oh, and look, I didn't mark it the same way. Okay, let me be consistent and underline it instead. But still, I do have a question about this. Why does Jesus use this drinking analogy? And does it tie in with the Lord's Supper? When Jesus passes the cup to his disciples and he says, drink, this is the blood of the new covenant, which is given for the forgiveness of sins. That's not an exact quote, but I think for the most part I got that right. So there might be some connection there with the Lord's Supper, specifically the cup, which represents the blood of the covenant. And again, and I'll highlight this phrase, your will be done. Again, for the second time, we see this inner turmoil in Jesus. And I think I'll point it back up to verse 39. Now, let me just say this now. For myself, I'm really excited to hear Pastor Rob preach on this passage, specifically on prayer, because you know he's going to be highlighting these verses. Verse 39, verse 41, verse 42. So I'm really interested to see how he really unpacks these prayers that we see Jesus praying. All right, let's keep moving. Looking at verse 43. And again, he came and found them sleeping. Who were sleeping? Well, at least it's Peter, James, and John, but it might be all of them that are sleeping. For, here's the reason why they were sleeping, their eyes were heavy. And I'm just highlighting that because, for me, it's kind of funny, right? Why are they sleeping? Well, obviously, it's because they're tired. Their eyes were heavy is just another way of saying it. I just find it funny that Matthew includes that. Maybe he's giving the disciples and himself an excuse, basically saying, look, it's late, we had a long day, and we were very tired. I don't know, that might be Matthew making himself and the disciples look a little bit better so the audience won't judge them too harshly about this. But this brings us to verse 44. So, and we'll just point that to the previous verse, verse 43. So, leaving them again, he went away. And I'm going to mark that word again. There's a lot of repetition going on. And look, he went away. Just another description of Jesus distancing himself. So, leaving them again, he went away and prayed. Again, we have prayer. I'm going to point that all the way up to verse 42. And again, this is for the third time Jesus prays. And instead of Matthew sharing with us what Jesus prayed, he just says that Jesus says the same words again. We'll just mark that phrase in purple. It would have been nice to get the exact words of Jesus and see how similar the third prayer was. And I also wonder why he didn't record it. For me, as the reader, I believe Jesus' prayer here in these verses are really important. But maybe for Matthew, he's already gotten his point across, and so he doesn't include it, which now brings us to verse 45. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Sleep and take your rest later on." Basically saying, look, I know you're tired. I know you need your rest and you want to sleep, but this is not the time. He continues on in verse 45. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man. I'll just highlight that in red. This is how Jesus describes himself. And the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. So I'll highlight that word betrayer, the one who is betraying Jesus into the hands of sinners. And I think I'm going to mark these commands. And we already have been marking them in some ways, but they jump out at me more in verses 45 and 46. Maybe I'll just put a mark next to them, and we'll go through and mark them all. So that phrase, sleep and take your rest later on, is a command. See, the hour is at hand. I think that's probably a command, right? To see. Then verse 46, rise, let us be going. And then see, my betrayer is at hand. Now, I haven't looked at the Greek grammar, so I don't know if these are commands or imperatives in the Greek grammar, but I'm guessing they are. All right, let me go back up to the top, and we're going to do two things. One is mark the commands that I see, and also try and identify the structure of this section. So the first command, sit here, in verse 36, while he goes over and prays. Then in verse 38, I think, is the next one. Remain here and watch with me. Remain here and watch. And I think verses 36 through 38 would be the first section. These three verses are kind of setting up what is about to take place in verse 39, where Jesus actually starts to pray to the Lord. Verse 39, of course, starts with going a little farther. So Jesus is beginning his time of prayer. I think that's kind of how I'm structuring it, which means the next section ends at verse 41. So verse 39 through 41, I'm thinking, is the second section, and it looks as though the next command is in verse 41, which is watch and pray. This brings us to verse 42. Again, for the second time he went away and prayed. And I think it ends at verse 44. So the third section starts in verse 42, ends in verse 44, which contains that third time Jesus goes off to pray. Actually, including both the second and third time that Jesus prays. And then we definitely see a transition in verse 45 when he comes back to the disciples. And that will be our last section. Again, this is just my first attempt on figuring out the structure. I don't know how accurate it is, but feel free to kind of work with that and come up with your own structure for this section. And it looks as though I covered all the commands. And let me conclude with this thought. As we take a step back, notice how Peter seems to be an important character in this section. Other than the sons of Zebedee, Peter is the one that is specifically named, and I would say he is included anytime Matthew mentions the disciples. And then in verses 45 and 46, it brings up the one who betrays Jesus, which is Judas. And remember what we talked about at the beginning of this video when we look at the whole context. These are characters who had some significant interactions with Jesus before we get to these passages. All right. Thank you again for coming along with me and studying this passage. Pastor Rob will be at Converge Community Church this Sunday morning preaching on this passage, and specifically when it comes to prayer. Remember, we're going a little more topical at the beginning of the year before we get into our Proverbs series. And of course, you can always check us out on our YouTube channel. All right, with that, may God bless you this week, and we'll see you next time.